Hello everyone and welcome back to another edition here of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. As always, welcome back to another great show. Today is Monday. Happy Monday. And on this Monday afternoon, we should have a great slate of segments for you, starting off by previewing not one, but two Monday Night Football games. Bears, Vikings, Falcons, Raiders, not the best of slates for this Monday evening, but still very interesting games nevertheless. We're going over some NFL fantasy stars of the weekend. There were plenty for your first round playoff matchup. Doing potentially my final positional rankings this week with my QBs. We'll get into what's going to happen with this week in the next couple of weeks in a couple minutes, but I will do my QB positional rankings nevertheless today. Going to be updating you on the Coach of the Year odds. We are continuing with this awards theme now that we are getting towards the end of the regular season here, and then concluding by previewing a CFP first round matchup here. The 8-9 matchup. Tennessee, Ohio State, perhaps the best matchup in terms of talent on the football field in the first round of the CFP. But before we get into any of that, one of two things to start off. A little bit of housekeeping here. The holidays are upon us, and I wish you all a safe and happy Christmas. But with that comes a little bit of a schedule change here. So, for this week, I'll be only doing shows today and Friday. I know you might be sad to see me not be here for this week, and then next week as well. There will be no shows for that week of Christmas, and then next week we continue with the Monday to Friday scheme. And not until we get into the month of January we'll be getting back to fully scheduled programming. But for all who might not be seeing this episode, I do wish you a happy holidays, happy Christmas, happy New Year, what have you. Stay safe out there. Then, as always, you know the drill in terms of following and keeping up with this network. Like, follow, and subscribe to the show in the network. Make yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube while you still can this year. But without further ado, let's jump into one of the final shows of the year here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. It was a pleasure bringing fantasy talk to you this year. Starting off, though, talking about the Monday Night Football games. Not one, but two, and they're definitely not the best we could have gotten tonight, but they are still very intriguing in terms of storyline. Let's start out with the division rivalry in this first slate game here. Bears, Vikings, Minnesota, 7-point favorites here. Ultimately, deservedly so, considering the state of the Bears right now, but like I said, this is divisional rivalry, and I imagine it's going to be a little bit more physical than I believe. Still, Vegas does not like this one at all in terms of over-unders, 43.5, Minnesota minus 300, Chicago plus 250 in terms of money line. So as you can see, pretty uneven in terms of betting odds here, slightly skewed towards the Minnesota Vikings. And when I look at this game in terms of storylines, it's more so about what the Vikings have been building here en route to an unexpected playoff berth. They just clinched last night due to the fact my Seahawks did not show up on national television. And now they're going to go into a postseason tournament that many expected they would not participate in. And in this tough division, they have proven that they can hang with both the Detroit Lions and the Green Bay Packers here. And most importantly, have just as good a resume as Detroit and Green Bay. In fact, Green Bay, not until last night did they beat anyone in the NFC with a winning record. So, as you can see, the Vikings are in great company here in terms of how they should feel in this division. But in order to win your division, you have to take care of the bottom feeders as well. You can't just go into that last game of the season against Detroit hoping that things fall your way. You have to beat up on the bottom feeders as well. And Chicago certainly feels like a bottom feeder now. We were wondering what this team would be like before the season. We saw glimpses of what it could be throughout the season, but now they're in a very bad place. Firing Matt Eberflus after that debacle of a Thanksgiving game. Now they're on interim head coach / OC Thomas Brown. We don't know what he is going to be for this Bears this upcoming season, but for now he is the interim head coach, and he hasn't necessarily gotten out to the best of starts. Last week was a disaster against the San Francisco 49ers. And I feel like this team is just a lamb being put up to slaughter in this gauntlet of a division. And I feel like, if the Bears were, say, in the NFC West, say, or the AFC South, they would have had a better shot this season, in my opinion, of getting something going. But that's just me, and it's just a hypothetical here. But in reality, they are an NFC North team, and they have to be treated as such. So in this matchup, I feel like, the Bears' defense, at the very least, can keep this closer than people think. They're very physical, young, tough defense that's perhaps the best part of this team and what this team should build on in the future as well to perfectly supplement what they believe Caleb Williams can do. Because right now, as I see it, when I look at the Bears, they're very disjointed in terms of how complementary they are in football games. Their defense can play pretty well, and then their offense can flounder. Their defense flounders, their offense plays well, and they can't put it all together. And thus, that's why the season has been such a mess in trying to interpret what the future of this Chicago Bears team is going to look like. But I do feel like if you truly think that Caleb Williams is the answer at the quarterback position, and I believe that he can be, then you invested a lot in the offense and now turn to the defense, because the defense is key here in Chicago for me. Because I look at it and I see a lot of good talent. It's just that they need more youthful infusion as well to continue this upward trend. And I don't think they're going to be competing as much in the NFC North in these next couple of years. But if they continue adding pieces, continue adding depth and experience to this roster, most importantly, they could be on the right track. And I'm not sure it's going to come with Thomas Brown because, well, we saw what his first game looked like, and it's not like he has an easy schedule to end the season here. But I do feel like if they can get a modicum of understanding out of these next 3 games, then you can start to see where you need to adjust this offseason. That being said, I have to take the Vikings here. They're just a better, more well-rounded team. And even on a long week where, they might have had a little bit too much time to think about that very impressive win against Atlanta, I still think they pull it off in a divisional rivalry here. That being said, I do respect what the Bears try to do this season. I do believe that Matt Eberflus got a little bit too in over his head, and that's the result that you get in terms of trying to meddle too much in Caleb Williams' rookie season. But ultimately, I do think that the Vikings right now are on a high, and they might not fall down until the playoffs. But who knows? Maybe this Vikings team could be built for the playoffs as well, and they shock everyone by going to the Super Bowl. We'll have to see. That being said, in this one game, give me the Vikings here. A simple decision. Then the lesser of these 2 games. Definitely the lesser of these 2 games. The Falcons taking on the stumbling, bumbling Las Vegas Raiders. Atlanta only 5-point favorites, so you can make the case that this line should be higher. Over under 44.5. Las Vegas plus 190. Atlanta minus 275. So as you can see, somehow, some way, Vegas still has a modicum of respect for the Las Vegas Raiders. And it might just be because of the young man at the tight end position playing his mind out. Brock Bowers, an incredible athlete, but going up against Atlanta, yes, they're a terrible defense. But do you really trust that a guy in Desmond Ridder, who, funnily enough, played for Atlanta and did not necessarily bolster hope that he could be the future of that franchise, can win a game with this Las Vegas Raiders offense? I don't necessarily think so. Brock Bowers, for all intents and purposes, could still be one of the best players in this game. But I don't necessarily think it's going to be important because I just think right now the Falcons are the more complete team. As funny as it is to say over these past 4 weeks where they've really struggled offensively, I do still think that Atlanta will have just enough to take over this game. But what I do want to see out of the Raiders, if anything, is how they really analyze the future of this franchise in terms of how much emphasis they place in these last couple of games here. If they play tough, right, and they actually look like they can win a couple of games, maybe come up a little bit short, but prove that they can hang tough, then I feel like, they might move on with this roster, maybe draft a quarterback in Sanders or Ward, and keep Antonio Pierce. But if not, then I do think that a wholesale change is coming in Las Vegas for next season. Maybe if Shedeur Sanders goes there, it comes with a package deal of his father. And so that's something to monitor here for the Raiders as well. But right now, in this game, give me Atlanta by a lot here. And I know it's tough trusting Kirk Cousins right now. A lot of people don't. He has an 0-8 touchdown to interception ratio over these past 4 games. He's been appalling in these games. But the funny thing is, the Falcons still control their destiny. They have the head-to-head tiebreaker over the Bucs. Should you know, the Bucs flounder, but I don't necessarily think the Bucs are floundering after what we saw out of them in Los Angeles. But then I look at the Raiders, and I just feel like even their best players have checked out. And Max Crosby is out for the season as well. So that's tough sledding for this Las Vegas Raiders team. As much as you can throw the football to Brock Powers and pray he becomes superhuman and can put up all the points you need offensively, then it's not going to look pretty for Las Vegas tonight. So that's just why I feel, even though Atlanta is playing just as poorly these past couple of weeks, I have to go with Atlanta here. I feel like Las Vegas is a little bit lost out there, and they're going to be directionless at least until the offseason. But, even in a lesser game, I still think it's going to be exciting because of how bad these teams are, just saying. But let me know what you think about these 2 games in the comments section, because it's not necessarily the best, like I said at the start of this segment, but it's certainly not, a terrible slate of games. But coming up next, we talk about the fantasy stars of this weekend. In the first round playoff matchups, who were the difference? We'll be right back after this short break to talk about that.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment of the day, as always, throughout our live streams, if you feel so inclined, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Great way to contribute and interact with the show. You could also do it through our website, gsmcpodcast.net as well. You can leave a tip or donation, or through the Super Chat, leave a comment, question, or concern you have throughout the show, and I'll be glad to answer them on air. I love hearing from you all. It just makes this show that much better. But without further ado, let us jump into our second segment, talking about some fantasy stars of the weekend, first round playoff matchups, and these are the difference makers that I saw in these matchups. Now, a lot of these players, mind you, outside of a couple obvious superstars here, were kind of hidden gems throughout the season. They may not have been with you through your entire fantasy journey this year, but they certainly helped you get to this point, no matter where they came along. And so I wanted to be emblematic of that, because I feel like this season has been all about unlocking hidden gems at each and every position, because some positions have been better than others, some have been worse than we expected. So I want to be as fair and partial as possible to certain players. Impartial, so to speak. But ultimately, the potential final list of fantasy stars I compiled is a very special one, because there's so much hidden talent here, and I feel like a lot of you really love this kind of advice and love hearing about how certain players have performed throughout this fantasy season. So without further ado, let's jump right into it, starting off with one of the best QBs in fantasy these past 5 years, and potentially in the running for his third MVP award. No matter what you think, I think that this game proved that this race isn't quite over yet here in the MVP race, but I do think that this player is making a great case for really running Josh Allen close in the voting. Lamar Jackson, 21 of 25, 290 yards, 5 touchdowns, 36.1 fantasy points. And yes, you can say with the Giants, yes, I was in that atmosphere and I saw, as I was heading towards the stadium, the John Mara out flags. John Mara has to fix this football team flag. So we know that this is a Giants team that is terrible that Lamar Jackson beat up on. But Lamar Jackson just proves that overall, you can't really count him out in terms of how you think about him. He can have these weird moments where the pass game and his dual threat ability don't often connect. He can have those moments, much like what Josh Allen had in his past. But I do feel like this season, Lamar Jackson has proven that he can be a Super Bowl caliber quarterback for the Ravens. And yes, they have a couple losses on their schedule that are questionable in terms of execution, in terms of decision making, that fall largely on Lamar Jackson as the quarterback of his football team. But when he's on, you can't deny that he's fantastic. 34 touchdowns to only 3 interceptions this season. That's unheard of in a race in which he's slowly lagging behind Josh Allen. And I feel like to count him out, whether it be in real life or in fantasy, is heretical at this point, because he's already proven what he can do in both regards. And sometimes people forget about it because they hold others up as well. And so that's why I really wanted to acknowledge Lamar Jackson here out of a bunch of different quarterbacks. But I also wanted to acknowledge a guy that's definitely not on your fantasy roster at this point in the season, and I hope not at this well. But he has certainly made a case to remain in the NFL, at least as a backup option. He has proven in these spot starts here for Jacksonville that he's competent and serviceable enough to potentially serve a football team next year in the National Football League. How about Mac Jones putting in a gutsy performance against the Jets? And I know it's the Jets as well, but this Jaguars team, from where it was when Trevor Lawrence went down to now, really is proven that they have heart and they're still playing for Doug Peterson, even though he's out the door at the end of the season, in my opinion. 31 of 46, 294 yards, 2 touchdowns, 2 interceptions, one of which, was kind of a garbage time interception when they were trying to drive down the field. 18.66 fantasy points, though, and yes, I know that you guys are skeptical of why I put him on this list, but it's just a matter of looking ahead, because I always love to. And now, in a time where fantasy is winding down, it's never too late to think about all these players who were given a second opportunity, a second chance in their NFL careers, and Mac Jones was one who took it. He didn't necessarily have the longest of times to prove it, but I feel like in these small sample sizes we've seen of him, that he feels competent enough to really bolster an NFL team in transition. Maybe a team, say, like the Titans or potentially the Giants or Raiders, although they have high-end draft picks, might pick him up and use him as a bridge option. So potentially, if, say, you're thinking about what Sam Darnold is doing in Minnesota and say, hey, if Mac Jones gets picked up, he might have a career rejuvenation, much like Sam Darnold is having now, and I might use him next year. So that's what I'm trying to do here in one of my final Fantasy Star segments of the year, is try and highlight some players who are given this opportunity this season to start anew. And Mac Jones has proven that he was one of them, even in these small sample sizes we see out of him. Now let's get into the better guys, the guys who we know are superstars. This guy didn't necessarily prove this season he was a superstar. Yes, most of the season he was festering in Las Vegas, kind of creating the tension that arose there, and then ultimately leaving to enter some more tension with the New York Jets. And we didn't really think that, this guy could get going again, but if you still have him on his roster, you should be very thankful, even if you didn't start him, because this is still a guy who we know can work magic on Sundays in the NFL. Davante Adams, 9 receptions, 198 yards, 2 touchdowns, 42.8 fantasy points. It was as if he and Rodgers were back in Green Bay. And even, if it's a bad win for Jets fans, you have to relish those vintage Rodgers-Adams connections and how we were reminded of them this Sunday. And I feel like, the reason why Davante Adams could still be an asset in these final games of your fantasy season, whether you're in your consolation bracket or competing for a championship, is because of that connection. Now, I know that a lot of Jets fans or a lot of fantasy football owners might think I'm insane by saying that, but I do feel as if this connection is still something special while we still can see it, while we can still witness it. And I feel like, against the Bills and other divisional games to close out the season, they might not look as potent together, but this reminded us of what magic they were able to create, and potentially one more go-around if this could potentially be the end for both of them in New York. Maybe this connection, no matter how late it has come in the season, can bear some fruit for you in a fantasy perspective. But ultimately, even if it's just a one-off thing, we still have to respect Davante Adams for his status as one of the league's top receivers over these past couple of years. And then in terms of running backs, let's talk about that position, because this position has been one of the most difficult to assess all year long. I don't really know if there are any tiers in terms of running backs, because there are so many high-end guys right now, right? You have your Saquons, you have your Henrys, you have players of that caliber. And then you get into the middle tier and you think, well, a lot of these guys can prove to be high-end starters for me, but a lot of them are too inconsistent to really merit consideration week in, week out. So I don't really know how to balance this position. Well, I can tell you this much. This was one of the worst weeks for running backs from a fantasy standpoint, but if you're an owner of Rico Dowdle, you have to be happy with how he's progressed in the absence of Dak Prescott. And I feel like, Rico Dowdle is someone this Cowboys organization should invest in, right? Because out of all these players in this organization, all these big money contracts coming up, Rico Dowdle's could prove to be the most vital in tying down future success for Dallas. Because let's be real here. I think a lot of what went wrong for Dallas this season stemmed from the contract conversations in the offseason between both Lamb and Dak Prescott. And so it kind of carried over into this season, kind of really set off a very tense season for Dallas because of the fact that they invested so much money into Dak and CD, and they had to ultimately, as a result, kind of build this team around them and kind of place them on the pedestal for Dallas. Whereas guys like Rico Dowdle, guys like Jake Ferguson, guys like Brandon Cooks, guys like Jalen Tolbert kind of fell to the wayside. But now, in his absence, they're playing a lot more freely, and this game for Rico Dowdle proved that he can be an integral piece to, when Dak Prescott comes back, the success of whether or not the Cowboys actually can build something here with this guy and these big contract that they have. 25 carries, 149 yards, 14.9 fantasy points for him. I just wanted to highlight him. And then last but not least, I had to do it because I said that this guy was one of my favorite starts of the week. Last week in my favorite start segment on Friday, Terry McLaurin, I had to include him on this list. 7 receptions, 73 yards, 2 touchdowns. Could have had way more. Had a couple of drops, what could have been very circus-like catches, but 26.3 fantasy points. Not bad of a prediction from your guy here. But ultimately, I feel like this list of NFL fantasy stars is a comprehensive list in terms of who we already knew were superstars and were integral pieces of getting you where you are right now, or the hidden gems who are you looking for in terms of the long-term future, guys who can be starting anew in terms of career arcs, but ultimately was such an exciting, exhilarating ride, delivering my fantasy stars list to you week in, week out, and hopefully we get to do it again soon. But you know what you think about it in the comments below, because coming next, we do in my potential final positional rankings of the NFL season and fantasy season for that matter at the QB position. You don't want to miss it. We'll be right back after this short break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, and for our third segment of today's show, one of my potential final positional rankings of the entire NFL and fantasy season. We're going to talk about the QB position. It's always a fun position to talk about, and if this is my last time picking 4 guys who can start for you on a moment's notice, week in and week out, it has truly been a pleasure, because this has been one of my favorite segments to add to the show throughout the entirety of the fantasy football season, and I'm sad to see it go. It's one less segment to talk about with you all, but ultimately you guys have made it such a pleasure to bring this advice to you week in and week out. But I know that this is crunch time for all of you. This is your second round playoff matchup, and you're trying to get into the championship round here, so I'm not beating around the bush. These are 4 of my best guys, and I feel like, going forward, these are 4 guys who could define the future of the position in terms of a fantasy perspective. But I do feel like, ultimately, I understand if you want to make a couple of risks down the line in terms of deciphering what you want to do in the future, but ultimately, if you are competing for a championship spot, this is the list for you. As Derek enters the chat, welcome to you, my friend. I have a fantasy keeper question. Is it alright if I asked and want to take you off topic? Of course. I always love a good question, my man. Keep them coming. But without further ado, let us jump into, while Derek is typing out his question, our first ranking here for this week. Oh, sorry, wrong graphic. Josh Allen going up against the Patriots. I mean, come on. This easy stuff. The guaranteed start of guaranteed starts for anyone in the fantasy postseason. 41.28 fantasy points against what many thought was the best team in the NFL at that point, the Detroit Lions, on the road, mind you, after doing the similar thing to the Rams defense a couple weeks ago. But going up against the Patriots, who are basically playing out the season, played in the least entertaining game yesterday, still have a decent future ahead of them, I think, if Drake May gets developed and draft picks are used wisely. But ultimately, right now, this is going to be Josh Allen's day. It's going to be Josh Allen's coronation as his first MVP award, and I do feel like, this is going to be a lot of people's pick to head into the championship game with, because ultimately, when we think about great fantasy QBs to utilize, Josh Allen is the one to think about. He's a no-brainer selection week in, week out, and if he does win the MVP award, his first in the league, it will be well deserved. So look for him to take you to the promised land both this week and next week in your championship games. And then another guy who's had a much more disappointing season in real life, but from a fantasy perspective have been lighting things up for you. Joe Burrow taking on the Browns. Now, I know that a lot of people are thinking that the Browns are one of those teams that can play spoiler and everyone still might be in on their defense, but I'm here to tell you that Joe Burrow doesn't care. And he hasn't cared all year. Whether win or lose, he just plays MVP caliber football week in, week out. And going up against the Browns, it's going to be a meaningless divisional game, right? Neither of these teams look like they're going to make the playoffs unless a miraculous thing happens where the Bengals win out and they have a lot of help. But ultimately, you shouldn't be worried about that because Joe Burrow will still be putting up gaudy fantasy numbers for you. Only 16.8 fantasy points. Very quiet game against Tennessee yesterday. Nobody was paying attention to it, though, because there were so many good games. But ultimately, against the Browns, look for Joe Burrow to deliver a championship-level performance for you in the second round of the fantasy postseason. And he's another guy, like I said, will define the future of this position for the next 4 to 5 years here. He has at least one of his weapons tied down for the long term. And waiting on Jamar Chase, he's going to have a very illustrious next couple of years. Maybe not necessarily contending in all of them, but still proving why he's one of the premier quarterbacks in the National Football League. So Joe Burrow, whether or not you are a little apprehensive about it just because of the fact the Bengals have been too volatile all season, or just because you might want to be looking to the long-term future if you're in a consolation bracket or other. But ultimately, Joe Burrow is going to be a very popular commodity in terms of who starts him in what scenarios down the stretch in the fantasy playoffs. So look for Joe Burrow to be the guy for you to ultimately define your fantasy success in these next two games. And if you want to go a little bit off the beaten path here in terms of selecting quarterbacks, these are two guys who I kind of wanted to present in this manner as well, but maybe not necessarily high-level starters in a championship setting just yet. And they've also had their flaws this season, but ultimately, they still have been able to produce at a high level from a fantasy perspective. As Derek asked the question, PPR league, I had to keep 3 players off my team the round I drafted them in forever if I keep them year after year. So he's talking about the dynasty leagues. Also, all 3 keepers can't be the same position. What 3 will you be keeping? Typing now. I am eager to hear who I'll be selecting from my man. So type away, my friend. But for the time being, let's talk about Jaden Daniels' success this season and what he could look like from a fantasy playoff perspective here going up against the Eagles. Now, I know it's a risky matchup here because the last time he played against the Eagles, it was definitely not his best game. And it really started a little bit of a downward spiral for him after a very efficient start to his NFL career. But after this bye, he looked very efficient yesterday against New Orleans to the tune of 23.64 fantasy points. I feel like he has the ability in these situations against a defense much like the Eagles to really remain that calm, composed, poised quarterback we saw to start the season in this matchup the second time around. He now knows what he has to be capable of doing against the Eagles after seeing what they did to him in that first matchup. So now, in a matchup in which I feel like the Eagles will still be heavily favored, they definitely look like, for now, the best team in the NFC, potentially the entire NFL. But Jaden Daniels, I feel like, has proven that in big moments he can prove to be unflappable, and this is his biggest moment yet. And this could also be to save their playoff lives, because looking at the NFC wildcard race, potentially, Seattle might slip in the NFC West, but if they win enough games, they could usurp the Commanders as the second wild card. So the Commanders want to keep their noses above water in terms of the wild card race as well. So look for Jaden Daniels to be hyper motivated by that as well, because I feel like this Commanders team has the big play potential, but it also has the ability to just dink and dunk down the field, which very few teams have. And I feel Jaden Daniels has been able to operate so well in terms of that system, in terms of playing within himself, and trusting Cliff Kingsbury in this offense. Because a lot of people were wondering down the stretch, whoa, what if Cliff Kingsbury falls off a cliff much like he did early in his NFL career with his offenses? I don't necessarily see it. And while they could have definitely closed out that game against New Orleans a little bit sooner yesterday, I still feel that Jayden Daniels got back to what he did best. Not force the issue, protect the football, and ultimately win the game. And so that's why Jayden Daniels this season has been so pivotal to a lot of people's success in fantasy. Because a lot of people were thinking that he wasn't even going to be the rookie quarterback to really take the fantasy world by storm. A lot of people thought he would have a little bit of an adjusting period to the NFL. Because of what Cliff Kingsbury has done, and because of his belief in him, I feel like Jayden Daniels become a very hot commodity. Whether you think of that in your fantasy championship or in your fantasy playoffs thus far, I'm not necessarily certain it will be enough to usurp your QB1. But still, thinking about what he's done this season, thinking about his efficiency and thinking about his long-term future for that matter, from a fantasy perspective, really sheds light on what he's achieved this season and how far along he already is in his development in this league. So that's why I have to pinpoint Jayden Daniels, even though he would be a little bit more of a risky pick in a second round or championship level matchup here for you in a fantasy perspective. And then last but not least, this guy, a lot of people were very hyped about to start this season. And I feel like a lot of people expected him to really take the fantasy world by storm and kind of become one of the faces of fantasy at the very least by the end of the season. Kind of slowed down a little bit as Derek enters the chat, but I do want to finish off my QB rankings, and then we'll get to your comment before the break, Derek. Kyler Murray. And I feel like these last couple of games, yes, are an easy slate for him, but they'll also determine how people think about him in the future. Because if it's just a humdrum game where the Cardinals play their usual style of football and it's more ball control than reliance on Kyler to win games, then maybe a lot of people will be justified in not necessarily looking highly on Kyler Murray in the next couple of years in a fantasy perspective. But I still think that Kyler Murray this season has done enough to warrant consideration for these types of matchups. You might not be too comfortable doing it, but ultimately in these easier games down the slate for the Cardinals, look for him to continue to prove why he is still an elite quarterback from a fantasy perspective. But I do want to get to Derek's comment here before the break. Now, if I heard correctly, he got to keep 3 players on his team the round I drafted them in forever, and they cannot be at the same position. So here they are. CeeDee Lamb was picked in the 3rd round. Alvin Kamara picked in the 7th round. Trey McBride, Ladd McConkey, Garrett Wilson, or BTJ, Brian Thomas Jr. And I feel like this is a difficult one because you have a lot of high-end talent, right? But I see guys like Ladd McConkey, Brian Thomas Jr., and this is a dynasty league that you're talking about here, which I believe it is, then those guys you might want to look into a little bit more heavily over guys who you already know are superstars. Now, if I hear you correctly, keeping 3 players the round they drafted them in. So, looking at the top 2 mid rounds here, you have CeeDee Lamb, Alvin Kamara, and Trey McBride. And I feel like, as weird as it is to say, I'm going to take Trey McBride here if I were you. I feel like, CD is in a situation where he might have to be the man a little bit too much for me to really enjoy what he can be for the Cowboys. And Alvin Kamara, he's just in a very bad situation there in the Saints. They really don't know what their future holds for them, and Alvin Kamara is getting up there in age, remember. So if I were you, I would pick the young, exciting tight end. As Derek was saying, I was thinking keeping CD, BDJ, and Trey McBride so they can't go all 3 wide receiver keepers. Well, I will say out of these top to mid players here, in the top rounds, Trey McBride looks the most appealing. Then if I were you, I would actually go BTJ, and then, that would be a difficult one because I would have to say if it were up to me, Trey McBride, BTJ, just because he feels like he's in a situation where Jacksonville should improve over these next couple of years. And if they get a stable coach, that connection between him and Lawrence could really pop. And then you might have to go Kamara here just because he is the only running back here. It's just a very weird situation now that I think about it because of all the receivers. But I feel like BTJ, Trey McBride are your young foundation, and you just have to hope that Alvin Kamara can either go to a situation much like Saquon and Derrick Henry are in now and rejuvenate his career, or the Saints can kind of get it together and figure out what they want to be these next couple of years. But that's just my opinion. But your opinion here with CD, BTJ, and Trey McBride, since you can't, okay, I can get that. So if you want to go in that direction, I didn't necessarily get the first part, then your choice as well will be completely fine. I didn't necessarily see the fact that you can keep 3 players, but they all couldn't be the same. I thought that you had to pick one of each, so that was my mistake there. But ultimately, I think you have to keep at least 2 young players here, and BTJ and Trey McBride will be the way to go. And I think that, CD could be a good choice, but Alvin Kamara, depending on how his career goes, could be the option for you as well. But let me know what you think in the comments as well, other viewers as well. But that's just my opinion. Thank you for your comments, Derek. Luckily for you, you're in a dynasty league, so hopefully throughout the next couple of years, your fantasy exploits will go well for you. But right after this short break, I will update you all on the Coach of the Year odds here, continuing with this awards season flavor here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast right after this short break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, and we are continuing with our NFL awards season flair here in terms of winding down the NFL regular season, looking ahead to who could win the major awards with our Coach of the Year updates. We always talk about the players here in terms of how they perform for you on and off the field. We never really talk about the guys who coach them, and I wanted to give them their due respect because this is a very intriguing Coach of the Year race. A lot of guys who have either really bolstered good teams over the past couple of years and gotten them to where they are now, or guys who we didn't expect to lead good outfits this year and have done the unexpected and really made this season very special for their team. So without further ado, let us jump right into the updated Coach of the Year odds, the top 5 at the very least. And at number 5, a guy who kind of had his case take a little bit of a hit with a very demoralizing loss to Tampa Bay. It's not going to take a hit for his team's playoff chances, but I do feel like that really summed up the ups and downs of what this coach brings you. But I do feel like if this team truly buys into his ethos and his philosophies, then this team can have a bright future ahead of it. I don't necessarily view them as that big a threat in the AFC this year, but I do think LA has a chance. If they truly invest in what Jim Harbaugh wants, they can have a chance. And he is number 5 on this list of Coach of the Year betting favorites at plus 850. Like I said, he could take a hit. You could potentially see other coaches outside of this top 5 make a little bit of a run here to usurp him in this 5th position. But I do feel like when I think about his resume just this season, from where the Chargers were in the Brandon Staley era, where Justin Herbert was asked to do a little bit too much in that offense, never really having a stable backfield to rely upon, to now where Jim Harbaugh is saying, you can take a little bit of a breather at certain moments of these games. You can rely on a stable backfield. And yes, the injury to J.K. Dobbins has proven that it might not have been as stable as we thought because both Edwards and Vidal have struggled. it's not necessarily Jim Harbaugh's fault with that. And I really can't fault Justin Herbert because he's been playing some of his most efficient footballers. Maybe not be as pretty as when he was this gunslinging quarterback out of Oregon who was taking the NFL by storm, but it's still efficient enough to where this Chargers team is developing him in the right way. And that's my big question with this ultimate coaching assessment. Can Jim Harbaugh ultimately continue entrusting Justin Herbert enough so that he doesn't revert to this kind of game control quarterback? Because that's not what he is. He's more timely now than he was, but he certainly isn't someone who's just handing the football off and dinking and dunking. No, he's certainly capable of taking the top half defenses, utilizing these receivers that he has, Quentin Johnston, Ladd McConkey, to the best of his abilities. But it's going to be down to Jim Harbaugh and what he wants out of Justin Herbert in the next couple of years of this team's development. And so that's why I think Jim Harbaugh for now is 5th on this list and could be dropping slowly depending on how the rest of the season plays out for the Chargers. But ultimately he has done an incredible job really investing in what was necessary to build his philosophy there in LA and already seeing it take shape. That's very hard to do when you're coming back to the NFL and you're using a much more archaic style of football than we're used to. So kudos to Jim Harbaugh for creating a contender there in LA, at least for the next couple of years. We'll have to see. But for now, I'm really acknowledging him as someone who has really done a fantastic job setting the foundation at least. But it's going to be all about getting it to the promised land. And for now, that's why I can't necessarily put him over anyone else in this list. Then number 4, another guy who is slowly starting to build something there in Denver, but with much more raw pieces and probably a little bit more impressive, in fact, way more impressive in certain regards, is Sean Payton's coaching performance this season for Denver. Plus 750, the 4th betting favorite here. And I just feel like, from where we saw this Denver Broncos team this offseason to even when they drafted Bo Nix to the start of his career to now has been an incredible arc for the coaching prowess of Sean Payton. We've seen him go from discontent in Russell Wilson and too stuck in his ways in certain times last season to now really believing in Bo Nix to improve steadily throughout the season to where he is now. To a point where Bo Nix can be competent enough to lead the Broncos to impressive wins or even impressive losses in certain situations, where we finally get to see the infrastructure of what this Denver Broncos team can be when there's steady quarterback play. And it's all down to Sean Payton, because ultimately a lot of people were growing frustrated with how he really kicked out Russell Wilson and brought in Bo Nix, and a lot of people didn't think it would work. In my opinion, I was one of them as well. And so for him to completely give over to Bo Nix in a way, to completely say, okay, you struggled out the season, but I'm going to continue to rely on you. And for him to reap the benefits of that has been highly impressive to watch this season. However, these 3 guys above him are all incredible motivators on even better playoff teams. And Sean Payton, for now, needs to prove that Bo Nix is not a fluke in even bigger situations for me to truly say that the Broncos and Sean Payton can truly be taken seriously on the grandest of stages. And that's why for now he sits at 4, in my opinion. Then the number 3 position. A guy who could have won this award all 18 years of his NFL career. Never in his entire career has he ever had a losing season. The paragon of consistency. And a lot of people should say give him the award. And I feel it will be justified if he does somehow get this award. He's definitely going to have a lot of challenges in the way, but ultimately Mike Tomlin is going to be a heavy favorite come NFL awards time. At plus 500, he's going to have to make up some ground here, But ultimately, look at what he's done. Not just this season, for the past 18 seasons of his coaching career. Never, ever, in the most dire of situations, in the best of situations, has he ever had a losing season. And look at this season in particular. One of the weirdest Pittsburgh Steelers seasons to date, where you have this quasi-quarterback controversy, where Justin Fields starts off the season, purportedly is the starter, because of the fact he starts 6 games for you. Then Russell Wilson comes back from injury and you say, well, even though Justin Fields is playing so well, we're going to start him. And still perform well. The point where you're one of the biggest contenders in the AFC, that is a miraculous achievement. And I think that when you look at all the seasons, even the really, really bad ones for Mike Tomlin, even last year, for example, compare it to this season, where it's really miraculous that he got the best out of 2 quarterbacks who were seemingly headed in bad directions, where Justin Fields' development in Chicago was being stunted and Russell Wilson was basically kicked out the door in Denver and no one seemed to want him. Taking them in, coaching them up, and getting them both to play at high levels. That is impressive, because you had at least a modicum of consistency when you had Ben Roethlisberger there. Yes, you've had a couple QB changes. You tried the Pickett experiment and it didn't work. But this season has been incredible, because these were unwanted goods, and Mike Tomlin got the best performances of their careers out of it somehow. Russell Wilson is looking the best since his Seattle days. And so that's why I think that Mike Tomlin's in the race. Whether he's going to win it or not, it remains to be seen. I do think he's sitting in a very good place now, where if these next contenders, both NFC North coaches, to give you a hint, kind of falter, he could ultimately steal this award, just because I feel like he has had the more impressive season of these 2 guys ahead of him. But for now, I think it's mainly because of the fact that it's just become a point of consistency for a guy like Mike Tomlin. But let's talk about these top 2 guys. Number 2, a guy that my dad will be very happy to see here, KOC, Kevin O'Connell, plus 400. Great head coach, great guy. Whenever you see him in interviews, whenever you see him in TV shows or documentaries, always seems very down to earth, very knowledgeable about the game. But what has impressed me about this Minnesota Vikings turnaround is the entirety of this coaching staff believing this team, not just Kevin O'Connell, which gives me pause in this awards race, because when I think about Coach of the Year, I think about one guy who's had a significant impact. And I feel like, you can make the case that Kevin O'Connell has made an impact not just on his players, but his staff as well, in terms of how he's truly believed in them throughout the season, to the point where they're a surprise contender in the NFC. But I do feel like, the season for Kevin O'Connell was based around reliance on the people around him as well. It was an all-encompassing effort for the Vikings. I also have to give credit to GM Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah here for bringing in Sam Darnold as kind of a stopgap now for the time being, as J.J. McCarthy recovers, and it remains to be seen whether or not they'd resign him in the offseason, but that's a masterstroke that we're not talking about enough in that department. So, while I love Kevin O'Connell, while I think he's one of the great young minds in the NFL, this top guy and Mike Tomlin both have shown that it's through their own impact rather than reliance on other teams. And this is not an indictment of Kevin O'Connell. And I don't want to make my dad angry here. But I do think that Mike Tomlin and this next guy on this list just have, through their singular impact on this team, done a little bit more than Kevin O'Connell in certain areas. But Kevin O'Connell, from what this team has thought of before the season to now, has done an incredible job. It's just that it was more of a team effort for Minnesota than one singular person. And this guy at the number 1 position kind of resembles that to a T here. Dan Campbell. Yes, this team has had its struggles. It's had its injuries throughout the year. And potentially that will be their undoing. But look where Dan Campbell has taken this team. Look where his energy, for that matter, has taken this team. On the doorstep of the NFC Championship, after they'd never been to a Super Bowl or even that far in over 50 years, to now being considered one of, if not the best teams in the entire National Football League. And it's all because Dan Campbell just relies on this football team. He knows that it's not necessarily the most talented roster, right? When I look at other teams around the NFL, there are certainly better players at every position over the Lions. We here at GSMC have done a comparison of the Lions and Eagles roster, and we agree that there is more talent on the Eagles roster. What he's doing with it and how he's relying on them, most importantly, in the most outrageous of situations, kicking random onsides, going for it on fourth down when the game is won, going for it so many times in the NFC Championship game, even though you had such an insurmountable lead, and you could have, if you wanted to, made the more conservative choice. That screams to me Coach of the Year. You go down with the ship when it goes down, but you elevate the team when you elevate it, and you really make it your own. And Dan Campbell has done it with this team in spades. Whether or not it leads to a Super Bowl, I'm not sure, but I have to commend him for what he's done, and I do think he's rightfully sitting on the throne for the ultimate betting favorite for Coach of the Year. But coming up after this short break to conclude today's show, let me know what you think about these Coach of the Year odds in the comments. We talk about a first-round CP matchup that could be the most exciting on the docket, Tennessee-Ohio State. I'll be right back to conclude the show right after the break with that. Hello everyone and welcome back to the final segment of the day here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. And to conclude today's show, we're going to be previewing a CFP first round matchup that is perhaps the most intriguing on the docket. It's the 8-9 match between Tennessee and Ohio State at the Horseshoe. Very well could have been a home game at Neyland Stadium for Tennessee because Ohio State did have that very detrimental loss in terms of their loss to Michigan at home, but ultimately it is still at Ohio Stadium, so that is why ultimately they are the favorite in this one. Looking at the betting perspective at 7.5, over under 47.5, Ohio State minus 280 to win, Tennessee plus 250 to win. And I think the reason why a lot of people are high on Ohio State in this one is A, the home field advantage, and B, the more well-rounded team. Because when I look at Tennessee, and we'll start off by talking about their chances in this game, I think about an offense that at times gets a little bit too one-dimensional and certainly feels like it's over-reliant on Dylan Sampson, who granted is one of the more underrated running backs in the country when it comes to that position, but ultimately can't be ground into submission time and time again, because of the fact that you need balance there. And we know what this Tennessee offense can be when Nico Iamaleava, their young freshman quarterback, sorry, I was thinking about the NFL there for a second. Their young freshman quarterback does sling the rock. He can make explosive plays happen down the field. He is capable of that, but it hasn't come against elite competition. When you look at Ohio State on the other side, they have one of the elite defenses in college football. In fact, a lot of people believe it is the number one defense statistically, at the very least, in terms of overall play. So when I think about what Tennessee has to do offensively, right, it's get the ball out of Nico's hands quickly when he is throwing the football and try and get Dylan Sampson going on latter downs rather than early downs. Because when I think about it, you have to set a certain tone against this Ohio State defense. And while Michigan did it with running, you don't want that to be your MO the entirety of the game. Because you do have chances, if you're Tennessee, to truly develop a rhythmic performance on the offensive side of the football if you trust Nico. And I feel like Josh Heupel in certain moments throughout the season hasn't trusted Nico in the biggest moments. And that's what's led to Tennessee's detriment. That's what's led to questions surrounding this team. And I feel like, if Dylan Sampson is on his game, they do have a chance. Especially, if they can sustain drives. But I don't want to get too over-reliant in certain situations to the point where they feel that Dylan Sampson can win the game single-handedly, because that's not going to happen. Because as much as Ohio State has struggled with opponent running attacks at certain moments, it's still not necessarily something that I feel will really hurt them if their offense gets going. Let's talk about that matchup here, because that matchup is the more intriguing one. Ohio State's offense against Tennessee's defense. Let's talk about Tennessee's defense for a little bit here. This is also no slouch of a defense, with one of the best defensive players and prospects in the 2025 NFL Draft, from James Pierce, coming off the edge. And so I do feel like that's where Tennessee could find an advantage here, at least in terms of ways they can try and win this football game. If you generate pressure on an OSU offensive line that, for the most part, has been banged up all year long, yes, they've gotten key players like Tate Ratledge back, but they have still shifted so many times that there haven't necessarily been a continuity that you would like from a CFPO line. I feel like Tennessee can get to a guy in Will Howard we're going to be looking at very closely in this matchup, because I do feel like the best parts of Tennessee come from quenching drives at the point of attack rather than, trying to defend in the back end, because I do think that's where Ohio State also has an overwhelming advantage. I do think that you have a chance to really confuse Will Howard in certain moments. So that's going to be an point of emphasis for Tennessee in this one that I'm going to be watching, because knowing Will Howard from my time as a Big 12 fan, particularly as a Texas fan when they were still there, watching him at Kansas State, one of the big issues with him in his career is the big mistake. And we saw it this season in their biggest game against Oregon, when he slid when he knew there was very little time left and ultimately ran up the clock. So we know that he's capable of really elevating this attack, really letting it breathe in certain moments when he has to, but he's also capable of making the mistake that could eliminate them from the CFP and ultimately, potentially, fire Ryan Day as well. Let's talk about that storyline a little bit. I wasn't expecting to talk about that storyline as much, but let's be clear here. There are 3 goals as an Ohio State football coach: beat Michigan, qualify for the CFP, and win the national championship. Ryan Day has failed in every single season here, except one, I believe, his first year when they beat Michigan. I'm not necessarily sure of those facts, but he has failed for the most part in more ways than one in that regard over these past couple of years of his tenure. So I do believe that if they don't win this game or don't make a deep run, avenge their loss to Oregon potentially, Ryan Day's out the door. And I feel like, that's going to be lingering a lot in the back of some players' minds here, because I do feel like Ryan Day is a solid coach. He has developed a lot of players, but a lot of what he's done has been through the portal. I don't necessarily know if Ohio State fails to either win a CFP game or win the entire thing, that a lot of these players will be satisfied with their careers at Ohio State. A lot of these players might abandon ship next year. And so I'm going to be looking at that storyline as well and how it affects certain players for Ohio State in this one as well. Because let's talk about Ohio State here. Obviously, when you look at them on paper, they are the most talented team in the country. On both sides of the football, for that matter. You have opponent defense at all three levels. You have JT Tuimoloau leading the front. You have Caleb Downs, the transfer from Alabama, in the back end. On offense, you have perhaps one of the best assemblages of talent Ohio State has ever seen at the wide receiver position. And I know that's kind of lofty in terms of who they've had over the past couple of years in terms of JSN and Marvin Harrison Jr., but when you look at Emeka Egbuka, Jeremiah Smith, Carnell Tate, players like that, these are all players outside of Emeka Egbuka, who's going to be a very high draft pick this year, who are going to be the future and faces of Ohio State for the next 3 or so years. And so that's why I feel like Ohio State has to try and get them going in this one, because they could be the difference here for this Ohio State offense. If Will Howard can connect on a lot of big plays to Smith, Egbuka, and Tate, this offense can get going at a very high level. But it's all going to come from this offensive line as well. You have players that you want up front there, with Tate Ratledge back, Josh Simmons playing at a very high level. You have to rely on them. And it's not going to be an easy test to really try and win this football game. But ultimately, when I look at it, and when I look at how Tennessee matches up in the secondary, I have to think that Ohio State will be kind of foaming at the bit here, or chomping at the bit here to try and get those guys going, because I don't really think Tennessee's seen anything like it, to be honest with you, in terms of who they've had to defend this year. And ultimately, not for nothing, I do feel like Quinshon Judkins and Travion Henderson are not just going to sit and stare at Will Howard throw the football 40 times. They are a big part of this too. When I talk about transfers, them coming here and wanting to win a championship here is a big part, because Travion Henderson would have had a great season otherwise, but because of Quinshon Judkins, he's really stepped up his game as well. And ultimately, it's going to come down to them really being X factors here. And I do think that if they get going, then potentially no one on that side of the bracket can stop them. Because I feel like if they win this matchup and they face Oregon again, and Quinshon Judkins and Travion Henderson are firing on all cylinders, then good luck to Oregon. Because that's how potent this team can be when every single level of that offense is clicking. But the reason why I'm a little bit apprehensive here in terms of ultimately saying that Ohio State blows the doors off Tennessee is because of that defensive run. That's the one matchup where Tennessee can make all the weapons on Ohio State's offense a moot point. Because if James Pierce gets to you and you're Will Howard, chances are you're going to revert back to the Will Howard who makes mistakes. Chances are you're not going to look as dominant as you had with all these weapons. That's the key here. If Will Howard faces pressure, pressure's going to mount on him. And ultimately, in the 2 games where they've lost this season, pressure got the better of him. And so that's going to be the thing that could help Tennessee win this football game. And I do believe that at the end of the day, when it comes down to predictions, Tennessee either covers the spread because of that defense or wins outright. And so I'm looking at this game a lot more closely than people think in terms of talent gap. And I think that if James Pierce Jr. is the star of this game, it can be closed rather quickly, and it could see Ohio State in another very disappointing season on a whimper. Let me know what you think about this in the comments below, because that will just about do it for today's show. I've been Christopher Shepard of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. You know what to do. Like, follow, and subscribe. Make yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. But other than that, I will see you on Friday. Again, weird holiday schedule. Happy holidays to you all if you don't watch the show until then. But other than that, I am out for today.